really appreciate the organizing committee setting this up. So what I will talk about in slightly quicker form than before was some of the emerging lessons from the COVID emergency for the longer term climate emergency. Next slide, please.
Bear with me. There you go.
And this just gives the website of my laboratory, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory, and the Twitter feed for the lab for anybody who wants to download any of the materials that I'll talk about as we go through the talk today. Next slide, please.
I apologize for this delay. I'm just having to switch between PowerPoint and Zoom, but I will get the hang of it. There you go.
And I just wanted to introduce my laboratory team to you. And the next slide just indicates some of the locations they've gone to. If we move to the next one, including people like Professor Antonio Buonasisi at MIT. But this is really to introduce the team, and much of the work I'll talk about has been done by this and some other remarkable individuals in the lab. Next slide, please. And I think that many of the lessons have started to filter into the popular literature. There's no question that one of the oldest mantras in the world of research comes up again and again here, and that there's simply no substitute for being prepared. And in both COVID and in the climate crisis, that really means a focus on research and development and education, both within the traditional academic and think tank worlds and to the broader population. One of the features that's been most striking about the response to COVID has been how vulnerable our supply chains are. From the slightly humorous issues of running out of toilet paper, or in Berkeley running out of tofu, to the more serious issues of not having enough ventilators and masks, and watching some of the truly heroic efforts to scramble to get them re-imported from China, whether it's on Robert Kraft's airplane or professional basketball players, or finding that we're much, much more dependent than we normally think by looking at the way we purchase goods, be it by Amazon or anything else. This really highlights how on a hot, crowded planet, we are all the more vulnerable as we try to deal with these sorts of crises. And of course, that leads into what may be one of the most shocking revelations for many people, and that is that these tipping points happen fast. It went very quickly from talking about this as a problem that seemed more similar to some people in Europe and the US as an episode like SARS, or Ebola as a horrible thing, but for someone else. It very quickly came to our shores, and now that the US is ground zero for the worst response, arguably, of any country, we're seeing this tipping point happen particularly fast. And even though most of the dialogue around climate is that it is a slow process, I want to highlight that the same sorts of remarkable damages to our supply chains, to food supplies, to local and regional weather are likely to happen in this crisis as well. The next point is one where there's a great deal of debate, and that is that individual actions matter, and both they matter in the good and the bad ways, in terms of infecting other people, but also educating and partnering with other people. What we do individually does critically matter, despite many of the debates that the climate crisis is not about moving to recyclable straws or individual actions. And I'll argue later on that while it's critical we have to inform the big changes, these individual actions are truly critical. The last point is really the one that I will spend most of the time on the talk about, and that is that we are learning the hard way that without thinking about environmental justice and putting the needs and the lack of resources for the most vulnerable first, we will never solve this. And that's everything from reinfection rates to lack of medical care in many of our least served communities around the US and around the world. And it's this last one that is really the key. So next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about the numbers, and noticing this is a log plot, I really want to highlight just the key feature here, that if you look back when the US had 2,000 cases, this dotted line, what it said about your odds of infection in terms of attending groups of various sizes. And so back then, it looked quite reasonable to think that, oh, smaller gatherings were okay because your percentage of illness was low. But if next slide, please, if we update to today, with over 200,000 cases in the United States, I made this slide when it was only, quote unquote, 186,000 yesterday. We now see that even those smallest gatherings are in fact critical for infection. And as much as the affluent can socially isolate, it's harder and harder the more your employment goes through the gig economy or through the uninsured world for which many people work. And so highlighting the justice angle is not just about providing for the needy, it's about recognizing how interconnected we are. Next slide, please. And of course, all of these disasters do start in the famous movie adage with the government ignoring scientists. And unfortunately, that has happened here, both on the climate side and on the COVID side. Next slide, please. And as we look at the numbers that are now starting to appear, the unemployment figures, which seemed a distant worry, are now quite immediate. Some of the latest estimates are that we are perhaps approaching 17 to 20% unemployment. Estimates coming out of Rutgers are that Louisiana could experience 45% unemployment, are remarkable. And of course, this hockey stick is very similar and very reminiscent of another one. Next slide. And that's the climate one that gets all the more attention, where this transition very rapidly from a seemingly normal flow of events to this truly scary apocalyptic situation is one where COVID is giving us a preview and a taste of the many different disasters in the climate world. Next slide, please. Whoops. And so you're doing the heroic duty. And of course, one of the areas, if we begin this march through the COVID climate connections, one of them is simply if we are not staffing and doing proper preparation, both for new research and development and for managing that which we need, we put ourselves in an incredibly vulnerable, in fact, an embarrassing position. And I just highlight this data from the level of unfilled positions in the current administration as yet one of the many condemnations of our inability to act properly and quickly and think through the implications. Next slide, please. As we look at the climate issue, the health aspects become particularly clear. If we look at what a 3°C world will potentially bring us, we see that essentially everyone will be affected and affected quite seriously by heat waves and water stress affecting roughly half of us. And the impacts on crops and other things are quite severe. Next slide. The 2-degree world shows a relatively similar picture, and thankfully the international community, unfortunately with the exception of the United States, has adopted what we see in the next slide of the 1.5 scenario, where far from a pain-free world, dramatic issues in terms of exposures, water stress, crop yields, but a dramatically different and hopefully more manageable picture. And so getting on the proper climate path and getting on early is absolutely critical. Next slide, please. As we think about that strategy in the macro sense, here we see the pathway of the prior do-nothing world, the recommended pathway to get us to 2°C and in fact 1.5, and really what Paris got us online for was, next slide please, committing to do everything to cut out the orange part of this curve. And with the Kigali Accord that followed shortly after Paris, next slide, another ½ degree of commitments, and one more advance, please, next slide. Where if we had done what we said in Paris, we would have been on a pathway to roughly cut our warming in half, but recognizing we need many more innovations to go. And arguably, being on this path would make the types of events like COVID that much less likely in future. And that's emerging research coming out of a number of groups where we see roughly that our overall population times our levels of affluence lead on a very rough basis to the types of events we see in the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. And in fact, oh, sorry, go back one, back several, sorry. Keep going back. Oops, you're going the wrong way. Sorry about that.
I'm really sorry.
No worries. I didn't realize we were I asked you to do this. You can just jump all the way back to where we were before.
Yeah. We were here.
Oops.
Am I going backwards or forwards?
You're going forward. You want to go the other way.
This way. How did I get so lost? Here we are.
No, keep going back. One more back. Stop right there. Yep.
Great.
Okay. So go forward one. So this really highlights the critical issue around so-called flattening the curve, a term we hear all the time for COVID in the climate world. And while most people focus on the growth in emissions, which is critical, what I really want to highlight is that to achieve that 1.5 degree world, to bring down all of these risks, including some of the disease risks, we're going to need to effectively zero our emissions over the coming decades. Well, the problem, of course, is that as the peak gets higher, that makes this job all the more difficult. But in particular, it takes us out of a regime where we have even much understanding of how to make the transition. And I illustrate that because if we continue to wait, we move from the blue curve, which has about a 3% annual decarbonization needed for decades, not for the weeks or months of the coronavirus. But if we blow past that, the orange line is a 4% per year decarbonization needed to achieve the targets. And then the red is a 5%. And I highlight this because we have some data on parts of the United States, notably California, China, parts of Europe, achieving and sustaining that 3%, the blue curve, for years, not decades. But we have no experience at the 4 or 5% per year long-term decarbonization. I'm not saying we can't do it, but what it says is that if we want to base things to some extent on what we see in reality in our ability to enact green policies, moving beyond the blue is a recipe for more and more suffering. Next slide, please. I'll just go on while she switches it over. The next slide will highlight some of the good news out there. Whoops. There we go. The good news is that our ability to innovate is still very strong. This shows the famous learning curve, or Moore's law, or the end. Oops, can we go back? This shows the learning rate, again, log axes, showing the rate of improvement of different storage technologies over time. And the important message here is really twofold. One is that there's a range of different storage technologies, from chemical batteries such as lithium ion, to flywheels, to flow batteries, that are all showing improvement. And we have a diversity of different types of materials, different applications, different market niches available, such that the type of learning we talk about all the time for solar having dropped dramatically in price is going on today for storage. In fact, it's going on as rapidly for storage today as it ever did for solar. And that gives us great hope that if we can truly take the lessons from climate change and COVID to heart, we are building the technology base to absolutely get us there. And I illustrate that in practice by the next slide, which shows the overnight cost of new energy technologies to be installed in the US today. The green in the middle is wind. There's a small patch of blue in Wisconsin where nuclear would be the least cost. The purple in the Southwest predominantly is for large-scale solar, and the rust or orange color is for natural gas at current overnight costs. If we move, however, to the price of carbon in New England, next slide, please. We see an adjustment in the curve. We see more up. So I go back. It was just advancing one slide at this point. So go back one more slide. This is with the price of carbon that you're experiencing in Massachusetts under the RGGI coalition, even though I'm a little bit worried about watching some states potentially look to remove themselves. And if we move to the price of carbon in California, the next slide, just advance one slide here if you could. There we go. Here we see solar taking a huge bite out of natural gas as the least cost. And many economists, certainly most environmental economists I know, say that the market price of carbon, even in California, is not reflecting its true social cost, which is the next slide, at $50 a ton. And you can see this is a world dominated by renewables. There's a tiny patch of gas remaining. Ironically, it's in the area partially served by the Pacific Northwest Hydro. But this really puts the innovation and the evolution of our energy technologies from solar to wind to storage in a market context. And it says that if we take the lessons from COVID and stimulus seriously, we really do have the tools to make this dramatic transition to 100% renewables. Next slide, please. That story is not just one that plays out in the United States. This shows a map of electric vehicle deployment in China, and I want to get there via a brief video. Now, this will be the more challenging part for me not to run it directly. If you can move your cursor over to the black box at right down the bottom, this is a map of New England. Don't click it quite up. Okay, here it goes. This is a simulation of electric vehicles in use in New York City if every taxi was an electric vehicle. And what you can see from midnight when the simulation starts to moving through rush hour during the day, here we are in rush hour, if you could just let it run, there we go. What you see is red taxis are occupied, the blue ones are not, and you see the flood of electric taxis down into lower Manhattan. The green circles appearing are where the vehicles would optimally need to go to recharge. Maybe we can just run that video again. So you can see that over nighttime, there's some activity, and then people are charging up during the night. And then as we get, now we're at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. As we get to rush hour, you'll see a flood of taxis into lower Manhattan. And then as rush hour ends, they need to go find places to recharge themselves. And while I won't get into the politics of Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, the battles over New York played out in an interesting way in this work that we did for the city of New York, but eventually adopted in China, not in New York, where instead of just talking through what it would take to implement large-scale electric vehicles, several Chinese cities took the lead. Next slide, please. Here is an image from Shenzhen in southern China, where they committed and achieved a complete transformation in their electric vehicle fleet, going in just a matter of a year and a half to more than 25,000 EV taxis. And now we see in Guangzhou and Chengdu and elsewhere, similar transitions afoot, not only for electric vehicles, but also for buses. And I highlight this for two reasons. One is that we know that building key demands for green electricity will be critical in the process. as is happening here in China, and because the data energy interface, or the IT-ET interface, if you will, is critical to using our renewable resources most efficiently. In the case of Shenzhen, it took a very simple app that we developed to dramatically improve the charging waiting times for this rapidly growing fleet of EV drivers. Next slide, please. This really highlights a industrialized nation version, but the same thing is true in the world of developing poorest economies. In an effort that's joint between MIT, Berkeley, University of Waterloo, Arizona State, Karlsruhe in Germany, and Oxford, we have also developed an effort to work with local communities to bring renewable energy to relief camps. And this is an effort that I'm very, very proud to co-chair with the team you can see here. We recently published the first wave of these findings in the proceedings of the IEEE, and very soon we hope to be able to announce a massive program focusing on relief communities in Uganda, South Sudan, and in the Congo to start, and then working more globally to bring distributed renewable energy to the communities that truly have the least of all the resources to battle both outbreaks like COVID and climate. Next slide, please. And next slide as well. An example that really brings this into stark contrast is an effort in Kibera, the largest slum in Nairobi, and you can just advance the slide, I believe, twice to bring everything online. And this is again, the largest slum in Kenya, where a women's center powered by renewables, which you advance the slide twice more, I believe, installed solar and storage on its rooftop, but is using that hub of clean energy in the midst of this very low-income area, advance the slide one more, to build a franchise model. We're taking advantage of IT solutions, in particular billing by cell phones, and the deployment of solar and storage. You can advance the slide again. We are able to offer the neighboring homes and stores an ability to hook into this mini grid to power, to provide a collective power that is then sent out to the communities in the area. And again, I highlight this one because this center in particular is one where hand washing and medical supplies are being provided in a setting where there is very little state management. Next slide, please. And really, when we talk about these opportunities, from the large scale ones I mentioned in China to these very small scale off-grid ones, one of the most pressing lessons that I think all of us on the research side and many on the public policy and industry side are having to grapple with is how can they learn the lessons from COVID to think more broadly but act more locally in terms of their solutions. And there is no better image than the Greta Thunberg climate strike for just over 2 years ago, when she was literally striking alone. To next slide, please. The movement where in the September global rally, we saw the largest single coordinated action arguably in human history in terms of the youth-led climate strikes around the planet, and also a clear discussion of the degree to which justice would have to be part of our solution. In Greta Thunberg's case, it's intergenerational justice. And the next few slides, which I'll do quickly because we started late, I want to highlight the energy lessons we can learn. Next slide, please. One of them certainly is that greening our energy system without greening our financial system, as I tried to highlight in this 2013 op-ed in our local University of California paper, which I must say was not received particularly well by the financial offices of the university, resulted, unfortunately, 7 years later, in a vote and a move to divest entirely from fossil fuels in the entire UC system. And those of us who are related to that red brick university up the road from you at MIT are right now in the voting process, and hopefully will be our divestment process there. But this both speaks to the need to think through our solutions and to recognizing that while green electricity is one thing, green money is yet another, and we cannot honestly do one without the other. Next slide. In our own case in California, we have ramped up the amount of renewables. You see the percentages here, and if we just do the next slide to move us along. California is now on a pace to achieve, one more slide advance, 60% renewables by 2030 and 100%, one more advance, and to move to 100% renewables by 2045. And an example of that is a slide you see right now. Let's just stay right here, where all new homes built in California after January 1st of this year must generate as much energy as they consume. And again, it's the sort of investment effort that makes great climate sense, but as I'll try to highlight in my remaining few minutes, we do have a challenge on the justice side. Next slide. Our buildings as well are committed to be net zero energy by 2030, something we don't know how to do technically, but in the braveness of our legislature, they put together at the same time they passed the requirement for homes. Next slide. And I'll finish up quickly on the mismatch between what we can do technically and what we do socially. So one of the big challenges in many places that have taken on climate is that environmental justice has not been a co-equal part of that dialogue. That's certainly what we're seeing in the COVID crisis in terms of sheltering in place may be an inconvenience for the affluent or for some students, but it's economic a nightmare for low-income people who don't have the ability, whose work is one that requires them to be on site to do so, or else they're simply not paid with no backstop. And so next slide really highlights an area where we did not learn the lesson the first time. I'll skip this one for time. This really just runs through the history of California, but I know we're close to when you need us to transition. So let me move to one that explains in more detail. If you just go one more advance. So one of the huge challenges is that while providing subsidies for solar on rooftops or electric vehicles in garages, what we've done is at the same time in a place like California is to require the lower income people to drive ridiculously long distances to get to work because we've failed to provide low income infill housing. And so in this New York Times piece, we highlighted this in terms of the so-called drive till you qualify phenomena that people in many of our high-tech centers, 128 around Silicon Valley here, around UT, Texas, Austin, all have to push the lowest income workers with the longest drives, the most inequitable choice we make in terms of housing, because housing is in fact a key element of our climate policy. Next slide. A version of addressing this is a project which is sprung up here in Oakland. We've now seen versions in the Netherlands and Paris and elsewhere. And this is a case of solar on rooftops, but not home by home. In this case, the solar is installed on all the homes in this so-called eco-block, a low-income section of Oakland, California. But the solar is pooled into a single garage, the gray building at the top middle of the screen, and is then redistributed to the homes and to EV charging stations, not individually owned, but roadside ones, so that everyone in the community can take advantage of the shared solar resource. Next slide, and I'll wrap up quite quickly. Just jump across this slide. It has a little bit of an animation in it. Just go 3 or 4 advances. Keep going. And one of the really right there. One of the really worrying results is that while we've done a fine job, as I mentioned, in starting to bring solar for the more affluent, here we have data in a project with Google where we found that even when you control for income, solar is far more common on the roofs of white households than on Latino or African-American households. In fact, 30% more likely on a white rooftop than a Latino rooftop, and up to 70% more likely on an African-American rooftop. And this is largely because of when and where we started the process of subsidizing and starting solar companies, primarily with community groups that had already been empowered, leaving behind many of the communities of color. Next slide, please. Just highlight some of the, I'll skip over this one because I know we're very tight. Next slide, please. And really to wrap it up, one of the, go back one if you don't mind. And really to wrap this up, what I've been trying to highlight is that while a stimulus package is clearly needed for COVID, a larger stimulus package, one that lasts longer, is needed as we think about the climate crisis. And so Monday last week, a group of us you see listed here released an open letter to Congress, a green stimulus, also at the $2 trillion level, that highlights many of the features that I've talked through in this talk. I urge you to go to the website to look at this. There's been more than 2,000 signatories endorsing this position and ongoing dialogues with members of the House and Senate to talk through how investing on green vehicles, green roofs, urban efficiency, essentially provides the best route we know to inoculate ourselves against the climate crisis. I want to thank you, and I want to particularly thank the help in advancing the slides, and apologies for the start, and I look forward to the rest of the day in the dialogue. Again, my thanks. We'll stop right there.
Great. Thank you for this really interesting talk. And we are running a little bit over time. However, since the next panel is followed by a break, I think we do have time for a couple questions just to honor this great talk. So we have, let me stop sharing. We do have some questions here. So I'm going to read from the most upvoted question, which is, can you post the slides? Do you mind if we share this, or?
I'd be delighted if you do that. You have the deck, and please post. It's a large file because of the video, but you may absolutely share it.
Great. So we'll be posting that on the MIT Energy Conference website. So moving on to the second question, how should policymakers approach drawing parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate change? And when is it appropriate to start doing so?
Well, the second part's easier. It's certainly appropriate to do so right now because the climate crisis is with us today. It will persist. And the worry is that what we've learned from behavioral economics so far is that it's often easy to get people to do an initial action, such as saving energy right when there's a wildfire or when they see that COVID affects them personally, to put a mask on. But the challenge is sustaining that. And while we've been having a federal debate with the president whether the country should reopen mid-month on Easter or wait till the end of the month or go beyond that, the climate crisis is one that we are going to have to do something of much more of a mental regime change, because we will not solve climate in 1 year. We will not solve climate in 10 years. We will need a longer term run where these types of actions get institutionalized. And that's one reason for the argument for the green stimulus, but it's a larger argument for investment in those most left out of this conversation. Because ultimately, if the green energy movement doesn't much more rapidly become one that's equitable and inclusive, our ability to sustain interest and relevance is going to be very challenging. So both need to happen now, but the real challenge is the mind shift change so that we can see the 30 years or so of transition we need for climate, not as a 30 years of austerity. Few would endorse that, but as a true opportunity to invest in these more job creating, more equitable technologies.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask one more question before switching to the next panel. This one is from Sharon. Now the most upvoted one is from anonymous attendee. How can citizens and state and federal governments in the US promote and support development of next generation nuclear power? With concerns about nuclear scientists and waste management, no one seems to want to touch this, but it would be critically important part of the path to decarbonize our economy.
So as a professor of nuclear engineering, I'm well aware that the opinions on nuclear are varied and strong. And for nuclear to play a critical role in the next part of the process, really two things need to happen. One is this grand experiment we've embarked on of a great number of smaller private sector run commercial nuclear technologies, the 123s, the TerraPowers, the NuScales, a whole variety of technologies which are different either technologically or in terms of being much smaller individual reactors. On the one hand, that process will need to play out to successfully deploy reactors. In fact, one of the trials, a well-known Bill Gates company, will be launching its first at Idaho National Labs with a 2026 deployment. But the story is not just about getting these technologies in the field. The real challenge as well is that the market economics of nuclear are going to have to also undertake a significant evolution, because at present, the nuclear reactors that we have in place are A, highly expensive, and B, all will need to be retired in the coming decades. And that means for nuclear to play a significant role, i.e. not just hang on to, not even its market share, but its current generation amount, we would need to replace the roughly 420 reactors worldwide with a new equivalent fleet worth for them even to maintain their generation share, let alone their percentage in the overall mix. And nuclear is 10% globally today with that 420 reactors. So this is an issue that harkens back to my first slide, which really tried to look at the degree to which we need to deploy what we know how to do, and we need to continue innovating. And nuclear is absolutely at that pinch point where without both, it may be a small part of the story, but it will not be a large piece of it as the questioner is highlighting.
Great. Thank you